I'm Gary Hill, and I've been given the privilege of introducing and interviewing Dr. Robert H. Heptinstall for the International Society of Nephrology's Legacy Series. And I suppose the best way to start, so that the viewers will have a skeleton on which to build, is for you to give us a brief outline of your career.
Well, Gary, you must remember that I'm speaking from about 100 years back. I'll do it to the best of my recollection. I went to medical school in London. I started medicine just before the war broke out. I graduated in 1943. Course was shortened, of course. And after a 6-month stint as house surgeon, or I suppose intern in surgery in American terminology, I went off to the war. I went to the Far East. I was there for about 3 years, mainly as a regimental medical officer. Then I got back in that very cold winter, January 1947, and took a 3-month vacation to recover from my exertions in the army. And I then decided to start looking for a job. I went up to London. I went to my old hospital, Charing Cross, and told them that I did not wish to continue with surgery, which I had intended doing originally. They were not very pleased at that, did not like the idea of my doing pathology. So I went to St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, where I did my training in pathology, was appointed to the faculty there, and I stayed there until 1954, when in 1954 I took a year's leave of absence to come over to Johns Hopkins. It was my first visit here as a Medical Research Council Fellow to work with Arnold Rich. In the event, I spent most of my time working with Fred Gamuth, as we shall describe later. And then I went back to England. I continued at St. Mary's until 1960, when we decided to come over here permanently. And in 1960, I went as visiting professor to Washington University in St. Louis, where Stanley Hartroft was the chairman of the department. And then when Stanley left, I decided that I didn't really wish to stay there. And I came back to Hopkins. That was my second trip, when Ivan Bennett was the director of the Department of Pathology. You remember those days because you were working with me in the lab. They were very happy days between 1962, when I came back, and 1966. But in 1966, if you remember, Ivan decided that he was going to sit at the right hand of Lyndon Johnson in Washington. In fact, he went to the Office of Science and Technology and asked me if I would run the department while he was away. He said he'd be back in 2 years' time. Well, the devil never came back, and I was appointed Baxter Professor and Director on a permanent basis in 1969, and I continued with that until, under the local age rule, I retired. Well, didn't retire. I was given the grandiose title of Distinguished Service Professor of Pathology. That was in 1988, and that is the title I hold. I still come in 4 or 5 days a week, but of course the days are getting shorter, and I can't really say that I do very much that's meaningful. I teach the medical students. I help out with the renal biopsy service, and in the afternoons go home to a well-deserved rest.
Well, tell me, what have your, in the days gone by, your research interest been? I know some of these because I was part of them, but tell us about the entire spectrum.
Well, I suppose you can divide it up into three main areas. I've always been interested in infections of the kidney and their sequelae. I have been interested in hypertension, particularly as it relates to the kidney and to blood vessels, and I have been interested in atherosclerosis. Those are the three main areas that I've worked in.
Okay. Well, tell me, how did you get involved in all of this? Because you've outlined what you did, but we don't have the history involved.
All right. I got into the kidney and hypertension through George Pickering. George Pickering was the professor of medicine at St. Mary's. As you know, a very distinguished man in British medicine, well, world medicine for that matter, his main specialty being hypertension. Well, Pickering, during the war years, had collected a series of kidneys that had been removed from people for the intended relief of their very severe high blood pressure. What you've got to remember is that in those days, the antihypertensive drugs had not really appeared in the profusion that they have now, and the treatment of severe hypertension was usually very heroic. It was dorso-lumbar sympathectomies, chopping out 1 3/4 of the adrenals, and in certain circumstances, if it was felt that the disease, unilateral disease of the kidney was responsible, removal of that kidney, it would be hoped would alleviate the hypertension. So Pickering had a series of these kidneys, and although I was a very junior man in the pathology department, he asked me if I would look at those and that we would write a paper or two on the results of that. I'm sorry you interrupted. What?
Well, I was simply going to say, first of all, that the heroic measures were demanded in those days because the survival of these people was less than a year if they weren't treated.
Oh, very much so. Oh, yes. People with malignant hypertension, you had to number their days in terms of probably months, 6 months to a year. Very few survived over a year. And that is why these heroic measures were adopted. So what happened next was that I was very flattered to be asked that by the great man. But then when I began to think about it, I thought, well, you don't really know very much about this matter. So I started consulting various books and papers, and I found that I wasn't singular in that respect because very few people did know anything about it. Well, anyhow, to cut a long story short, I looked at those kidneys, and Pickering looked at them with me, and we wrote 2 papers, one on the reversibility of malignant hypertension, because in 3 of these patients who'd had malignant hypertension, the malignant hypertension was reversed, and that was quite an achievement, and that the paper we wrote as a result of that was probably the first demonstration that malignant hypertension that was proven histologically, because we had material to verify the necrotic vessels, probably that was the first case that had been described. And the other paper that appeared in the Quarterly Journal of Medicine was just on the general business of the treatment of hypertension. So that got me interested in 2 things. It got me interested in infections of the kidney, and it got me interested in hypertension. So that covers 2 of the 3 areas that I mentioned. Now, in addition to that, Pickering also, when we had finished that work, introduced me to a young fellow that he had working in his department, a young man called Brian Bronte Stewart. Bronte came from Cape Town, and he'd come to spend a year in Pickering's lab. Pickering asked me if I would collaborate with Bronte in an experimental study to see whether hypertension accentuated cholesterol-induced atherosclerosis. So Bronte and I worked on that. We had a wonderful time together. We found that, in point of fact, it did accentuate it. And that, I suppose, was the beginning of my lifelong interest in atherosclerosis. And we might talk about this a little bit later on. But that was the introduction.
Have you ever considered the fact that if you hadn't done this work, that perhaps the diet in America might be a little different?
Oh, I don't know. I can tell you something about the cholesterol story, but I was hoping to leave that for later.
Okay.
So yes, I will certainly touch on that point.
And the aspect of infection, you haven't really laid that out for us, and that, of course, is where I first knew you.
Yes, well, the early work I did on infections of the kidney was concerned mainly with finding out reasons why organisms localized in the kidney and the circumstances under which they did it, and then what was the sequence of events after that. We were also particularly interested in studying from an experimental point of view whether, in fact, chronic infections, chronic pyelonephritis, could generate hypertension. And that was quite a lot of the early work, and you were involved in a lot of that because you did those very elegant microangiographic studies which disproved one of the ideas put forward for the scarring in chronic pyelonephritis. An idea had been put forward that it was a function of the vascular narrowing, that the vascular narrowing came first, knocked out tubules, and caused scars. And I had shown it by showing that that was not the case with some rather crude angiographic studies, but yours were just so beautiful. I mean, yours were beautiful microangiographic studies, some of the best that have ever been done, and showed, and it really laid that old bogey to rest, that the scarring was really a function of the destructive inflammatory process, and the vascular changes, if they did appear at all, came later.
Fair enough.
Now, let me just continue. The other thing we did in pyelonephritis was to try and debunk the prevalent myth that chronic pyelonephritis was by far the commonest cause of chronic renal failure, which was very widely believed in the 1950s. And this, of course, stemmed from having rather insecure, loose criteria for diagnosing chronic pyelonephritis. So I spent quite a lot of time on that problem, but really the main credit for that should be given to John Hodson, and we'll probably talk about Hoddy, as he was usually called, later on, because Hoddy showed, he was a radiologist, he showed that there were certain radiologic criteria that had to be fulfilled. So on the pathology side, we showed that those criteria certainly had to be filled, but in addition there were microscopic changes that were not specific, that had been thought in the past to be specific, that Hodson, being a radiologist, did not have access to. So I think we were successful in cutting chronic pyelonephritis down to size. As you know, it changed its name. It is now known to certain people, not to me, as reflux nephropathy. So if you let reflux nephropathy supersede chronic pyelonephritis, well, I suppose chronic pyelonephritis is gone forever. But it hasn't, and you know it hasn't.
No, I certainly do. But you know, it's interesting. I think you were the person who was responsible for, in a sense, taking a disease which was the sort of the repository for huge numbers of individuals, and making what turned out to be a fairly exclusive club with rather stringent criteria for membership. And once you did that, there was not much left.
Exactly, exactly. But there was something left. I mean, chronic pyelonephritis, there's no doubt, particularly in children, is a very, very common cause of severe hypertension and of chronic renal failure.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's now sort of masquerading under this name, reflux nephropathy. Now, the other things you were also involved in, if we now come to the work on hypertension, you were intimately involved in those. And when I came back to Hopkins, I spent most of my time from 1960 to 1962 in St. Louis working on kidney infections. But when I got back to Baltimore in 1962, we put more emphasis on the hypertension work. Although, as we said earlier, we were still doing the kidney infections. And the main areas in which we worked were studying the juxtaglomerular apparatus as to what part that played in hypertension, what caused the signal for it to undergo hyperplasia. But probably the most important things we did were on the reaction of arteries and arterioles to hypertension. And the joint paper that you and I had together in the American Journal of Pathology showed very clearly that the old idea that the vascular necroses that are found in the arterioles and small arteries, it was thought that they were a function of the intense vasoconstriction, which I suppose was imagined to strangle them locally and cause them to undergo necrosis. But again, as a result of your very elegant microangiographic studies, we were able to show that the necroses took place in the dilated segments. So the idea was advanced that rather than this constriction causing the necroses, it was the inability of the vessel wall to withstand the distending pressure that was responsible. And this, of course, fitted in beautifully with the work that Gieser had done in Copenhagen, where he showed that there was an undue permeability in the dilated segments in hypertension induced, I don't know whether he used angiotensin or some other chemical method. I can't really remember what Gieser used, but anyhow, the two things fitted beautifully. Now, not only that, these studies also showed that it was the unrestricted passage of blood, presumably at high blood pressure, into the glomeruli that were responsible for the glomerular changes. And you christened this phenomenon that was seen microangiographically as the sunburst effect. And this just showed that the contrast material in the case of this experiment, but in life the blood, was getting through in very large amounts and wreaking havoc with the glomerulus. And then you did a study that has received very little recognition, but which, for my part, really clinched that matter, and that was when you produced vascular changes and glomerular changes by the forcible injection of saline into the renal artery. And the critical part of that experiment was when you then gave the animals some vascular relaxant, I think it was papaverine that you used, and then did the squirting, it accentuated the lesions enormously. And this, of course, fully confirmed that here was a dilated segment that was allowing vast amounts of blood under great pressure to get through to the glomeruli and to damage them. And as you know, this has now become terribly popular, but it's very happy to think that, very pleasant thought to think that we were well to the forefront
Yes.
in that field. Now, the last area, the atherosclerosis part, as I told you, Bronte Stewart and I showed that hypertension, this work was done in rabbits, and we produced hypertension by chopping out one kidney and putting a silver clip on the sole remaining one. It's the best way of producing hypertension in the rabbit. And then feeding them large amounts of cholesterol. And we showed, as I mentioned earlier, that in fact hypertension did accentuate it. And then after Bronte had gone, I did various other studies on experimental atherosclerosis. And in one of them, I collected together all the animals, all the data that we had. And they're a very large number. They'd all been treated in exactly the same way. And what we did, Ken Porter, Harry Barclay, two colleagues at St. Mary's were involved in this with me, we found that there was a beautiful straight line correlation between the amount of atherosclerosis produced and either the level of the blood pressure or the rise in blood pressure from its baseline. But that once you got over a certain level in the cholesterol, it bore no relationship to the cholesterol level at all. So we thought this was a nice bit of work, and we sent it off to Circulation Research, which we thought was a rather prestigious journal. Well, anyhow, in very short order, a letter came back saying, "Dear Dr. Heptinstall, I regret that we cannot accept this paper for circulation research. There are two main reasons for this. First, it conflicts too much with contemporary thought." Could you imagine turning down an article because it conflicted with contemporary thought? What, after all, is the purpose of doing research? And secondly, the statistical treatment is inappropriate. Well, the statistics were terribly simple, and they were done by a young man called Peter Armitage, who at this very moment is the leading statistician in the United Kingdom. So much for this editor, who was a physiologist. I shall not mention his name, and his tame little statistician. And I was so angry that I just tore this letter up. I really wish that I got it, because I'd love to have had that framed as a sort of a badge of honor, because it's absolute nonsense to turn a paper down for those reasons. Well, anyhow, I abandoned atherosclerosis research when I came over to this country, but when Earl Bendit put forward his monoclonal hypothesis, I mean, we can't go into the details of that, I decided that it would be something worth taking up. So we put in and got an RO1 and did quite a lot of very useful studies, extending confirming, first of all, what Bendit had shown, and extending them somewhat. But by that time, I was getting a little bit bogged down with research in the department, and most of the work in that was done by Tom Pearson and Kim Soles. So that is really, in a nutshell, the experimental work that I have done. But there are one or two other things that I like to think made significant contributions. One of them was a study on renal biopsies, and these were old-fashioned renal biopsies. These were very large, wedge-shaped pieces of kidney that had been taken out at the same time as the sympathetic chain was being stripped out. These were, again, for people with very severe hypertension, and as we mentioned earlier, this was one of the few treatments available. Well, the surgeon who was doing these things, a man called Dixon Wright, was sufficiently intelligent to realize that some of the that the kidney might have some clues to what was going on, and he very wisely did a wedge biopsy on every case that he did. So I had this wonderful series to work with, very similar to the series that Castleman and Smithwick had up in Boston. Ours was nowhere near as large, but I think it was worked on much more diligently, naturally, because there were fewer cases. You could spend more time on it. And what did come out of that study was that there was a very clear cut-off. That is, that those with vascular necroses, the malignant hypertensions, malignant hypertensives were in the upper register of pressures. And the other thing it showed very conclusively was that even in the presence of very severe hypertension, you need not have any significant vascular changes. And this finally convinced me that in essential hypertension, and this is what most of these people were, that the vascular changes were the result of the hypertension rather than the cause, which many people, including Harry Goldblatt, believed in. And then the second study that I think was an important one was the one that I did with Mark Ukers, and we'll talk more about Joe, as he was always called later. As a result of doing a large number of renal biopsies, we found that there was such an entity as focal glomerulonephritis. You know, this had only been described previously in patients with subacute bacterial endocarditis, but we found it in a wide variety of conditions, Schoenlein, Enoch, purpura, patients with the syndrome of recurrent hematuria. Probably many of these were IgA disease, but of course we weren't doing immunohistology in those days, so we'll never know. Well, anyhow, we put focal glomerulonephritis on the map in an article in the Quarterly Journal of Medicine, and then followed it up with a very large number, I think it was 30-odd cases, at a SIBA symposium that was held in about 1960 or 61. So anyhow, that's what I've spent my time doing.
I might say, with regard to the focal glomerulonephritis paper, that you were remarkably perspicacious in being able to recognize this lesion. If you had been able to do the study with the benefit of immunofluorescence, which in a sense didn't come on the market for another 7 or 8 years, it would have been even more mind-boggling. But I think that what should be noted is the fact that you recognize the lesions at a time when other people basically did not see and or did not understand the relationship between the light microscopic view and what was happening in the urine and what was happening in the patient. And the SIBA symposium from that period, was it 1960, 61?
61, I think.
61.
Yes.
Was in effect the landmark symposium on the utilization of renal biopsy in the treatment of renal disease.
Yes, I hope we'll have an opportunity to say something about the renal biopsy later, but you're absolutely right in what you said. And I, being a pathologist, a dyed-in-the-wool pathologist, I was very skeptical about these, and it was Joe who kept saying, well, look, these are focal, they've got to be. So I finally became convinced.
Yeah, exactly.
I've always been rather slow on the uptake, and well, I wouldn't say slow on the uptake, but slow to change my mind from what I've made it up to be. In fact, at a meeting once, Ed Cass referred to me as the president of the society that perpetuates the belief that the Earth is flat. But,
well, first of all, I would like to disagree with that. I would say that, first of all, I don't consider you slow on the uptake, and one thing that you're absolutely not is you are not slow on the quick riposte.
Slow to change. Slow to change.
Because I have been present for some absolutely devastatingly on-the-mark comments that you've made to people over the years that were that pierced rather large balloons that needed piercing.
Yes, made me a lot of enemies.
Well, I always think that it's gratifying when you say something to somebody and you hear as though you had put a pinprick in a balloon. And you were very good at doing that.
That is satisfying.
Yes. The area I think that most people consider you to be the ultimate master in, however, is the development of pathology of the kidney. And although there had been books on renal pathology prior to your book, I think it's absolutely fair to say that your book was the first book on true renal pathology in the modern era. And I would be curious to know how it is that you came to decide that this was a book that needed writing. How did you decide to spend the incredible amount of time that you did spend? Because, in fact, I saw you spending some of it. You were writing it when I was a student in your lab.
Well, Gary, it's very nice of you to say those kind things about the book.
I only say them because they're true.
How did it come about? All right. While I was still in England back in the 1950s, I had written various parts books. I wrote on 2 occasions for a very good British series called Recent Advances in Pathology. I wrote on the kidney for that. I also wrote a fairly large section on the kidney for the new British textbook on pathology that was being planned in the late 1950s, edited by George Paling Wright from Guy's and Bill Simmers from Charing Cross. And I wrote the kidney section on that. So that, coupled with the fact that there was really very little else written. I mean, if you go back to 1914, Wohlhardenfahr, Die Breitsche Nierenkrankheit, extremely good on what it covered. Then Fahr's contributions in Henke and Lubash on the kidney, again, quite remarkable. But these were in German, and most people were no longer able to read a German paper, let alone a thing of the length of Fahr's. Exactly. It was over 300 pages, I'm not sure. And anyhow, it was getting a bit out of date, you see, because there was no renal biopsy contribution to it. There were books available. Alexius T. Bell from Minnesota had a very good book. Arthur Allen had an atlas. Joe McManus had a book which was really mainly extolling the virtues of the PAS stain, but nonetheless had a lot of very good stuff in it. But none of those 3 was involved in renal biopsies. And I thought that this, around about 1961, when I first started thinking about this, was a most propitious time to do a book. So I started scratching around, consulting with publishing houses, and I decided that I would do a book eventually, and that Little Brown would publish it. And that was largely because of the most wonderful man Little Brown had, still alive. I saw him only about a year ago, Fred Bellevue.
I remember
met Fred.
Yes.
Fred persuaded me, the little Brown, with the publishers, and I'm very glad that I went along with them because they did a beautiful job. Well, anyhow, that now takes us up to about, by the time I'd arranged all this, 1962, that was the time I came back to Hopkins. Couldn't do very much in the first year because, as you know, I was setting up a lab and doing various other things. So it wasn't really until about 1963 that I started writing. And I wrote and wrote and wrote, as you know. It was a terrible intrusion into my family's life, and I will say something more about this later. I had to work every evening because I was working in the lab. You say you saw me writing the book in the daytime. That must have been the very few occasions that I got to write in the daytime, but it consumed every weekend. Well, anyhow, with the help of John Cusain, whom I'd met at WashU, John wrote a chapter on the development of the kidney and developmental defects, and Ken Porter, an old colleague of mine at St. Mary's, Ken wrote on renal transplantation. The book finally came out in 1966, and you probably can't remember as far back as that, but it sold for the princely sum of $28, if you can imagine that. The current one, I think, is about $325, or a tenfold increase in price. Of course, it's a little bit bigger, but I can't say that it's any better. Well, anyhow, there it was. That was the first edition. I did a second edition. The first edition, of course, did not have too much electron microscopy, and of course it had no immunohistology. But between 1966 and 74, when the second edition came out, there had been quite an explosion in both of those. So we did a second edition, and this time I got Bob McCluskey from Boston to do a section on immunologic injury, which he did a beautiful job. So the second edition came out, but I still wrote the great bulk of it. In fact, I wrote everything except 4 chapters. Well, then there was a third and a fourth edition. The third edition, I brought some junior people in, including yourself, Soles, Gene Olson, goodness knows who else, I can't remember. And we brought out a third edition. It incidentally expanded up to 3 volumes. The second edition went up to 2 volumes. This was 3. And it looked as though each edition was going to correspond to the number of volumes, or the other way round. Well, anyhow, I did a fourth edition with the same people, plus 1 or 2 more. Who else? Tony Risden came in from England, Fred Silver, Mel Schwartz, Steve Emancipator, various others. But even in spite of having all these other people, I still wrote half of the chapters. And this edition came out in, I think, 1992, by which time I was getting on in years, and I felt, well, it would probably be the last edition. Well, anyhow, when it came time to consider the 5th edition, I consulted with various people, and we came to the conclusion that I was really getting too old, because it's so difficult to keep up with things, and even though the spirit is willing, the flesh really is not. And I don't have the energy that I used to have, nor do I have the inclination. I've got other things that I want to do. I'm much more interested in the Peninsular War. I'd like really to do some extensive reading on that. So Little Brown very graciously agreed that in the future the book would be known as Heptinstall's Pathology of the Kidney, and that I would recruit some junior people to be the editors. And I was successful in doing that. Fred Silver, Gene Olson, Mel Schwartz, and Charles Jeanette from North Carolina, those four. And I wanted you to be one of them, but because of pressure of work and other problems, you couldn't do it. Let me just tell you, it was a very great disappointment to me that your name is not on the book. Well, anyhow, these four are employing great energy. I keep in touch with them. It's coming along very nicely. I agreed that I write a farewell chapter on urinary tract infections. They cut me down to one chapter instead of the two that I had, and that's perfectly all right. It's going to be a larger chapter than the other two. And they have been very generous in the number of pages they've given me, and I look forward to this new edition. I don't know when it'll be coming out, 2 or 3 years' time. But giving up that book was really, it was a great wrench. It was rather like giving away a child, I suppose. Not that I've ever done that. But there comes a time when you have got to pass the torch or whatever one does pass on.
I think that the manner in which you're passing on the torch makes a great deal of sense. First of all, I think that although other people may do some of the spade work, it'll be perfectly apparent to the readers of the 5th edition that you are the guiding force. You may not have read never corrected every comma in the book and checked every reference, as I can guarantee people you did in previous books. But you are still going to be the guiding force. But I should tell the people who are looking at this tape a little...
If anyone.
If anyone.
Yes. Yes.
A little about the greeting that the book received in 1966 when it came out, because it tells a lot about you in several different senses. First of all, the book came out almost exactly at the time of the International Society of Nephrology meeting in Washington that year. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And Little Brown managed to get copies of it to the convention, and it was interesting because you were obviously very proud of this. There was no hiding that. And yet you were also very, very modest about it. When people would come up and compliment you, you would give a sort of a throwaway line, oh, this, you know, it's very nice, but...
Quite out of character, isn't it?
Yes. But then, you were very, very gracious about it, and but quietly proud. But that night, we went to a banquet at the convention.
How boring.
But you were in fine form. First of all, you had a good deal of wine. Secondly, we were seated at the table with a number of Cubans. And after dinner, the Cubans, one of them, came out with a honest-to-God Cuban cigar. Now, this was 1966. This was only 3 years after the missile crisis.
But the embargo was still on.
But the embargo was still very definitely on. And I could see your eyes dilate in the darkness. And you said to the man, is that a Cuban cigar? And he said, si, senor. And you said, what a tragedy that relations between Cuba and the U.S. have come to such a pass that you can no longer get good cigars. And he handed you a cigar, yes. And you began smoking it, and after about 15 minutes, you turned to him again and said, Senor, what a tragedy it is that relations between the U.S. and Cuba have come to such a sad pass that a man can no longer get a decent cigar. And you ended the evening with about 6.
Oh, I remember that. You're absolutely right. And I even, I think, stooped so low as to persuade other people who are non-smokers to try and get these Cuban cigars. Yes, what a good memory you have.
It was a lot of fun.
Yes, I remember that.
But it was quite an occasion for you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it really was.
Yes.
And I'm sure that you enjoyed the cigars in good health.
Oh, yes, yes. Like one now, but they won't let us smoke.
Well, it occurs to me, you know, that you have been a part of nephrology as we now know it almost from the start. What changes have you seen? What accomplishments have we as nephrologists and nephropathologists made over the last 50 years?
Well, I think they made very considerable advancements. Let's just try and go back in time. When I started out in the late 1940s, early 1950s, as we mentioned earlier, there were books available, and the books made the best of what was available to them. But a book on the pathology of the kidney was entirely dependent on autopsy material, because at that time the renal biopsy had not appeared. So of necessity, what you were reading about was end-stage disease. And there were all sorts of strange classifications of glomerulonephritis, subacutes, and subacute, you remember, was used in two different senses. To some people, subacute meant a condition characterized by the nephrotic syndrome. To others, subacute meant a rapidly progressive azotemic course. Subchronic overlapped with subacute. It was a terrible mess. As we mentioned, pyelonephritis, very little written about it then, but then, of course, it all exploded later. So we were profoundly ignorant. As Joxer Daly said in Juno and the Paycock, things were in a state of chassis. They truly were. Well, anyhow.
Well, I could say that in addition to being in a state of chassis, a comment that I was amused at applies directly here, and that was that one of the heads of medicine at Mass General, when discussing pathology and its role in life, said something that absolutely infuriated me. He said, learning about medicine from pathology is sort of like trying to learn about banking from the bankruptcy court.
Oh, no.
Yes.
I can imagine who that was, but we won't mention his name. Yeah, isn't that awful?
Yes.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Terrible. Well, anyhow, there it was. We knew there was nothing in these books, we see, about the milder diseases, the ones that recovered. So, although we knew a great deal, it was all of an end-stage type and reflecting the more serious conditions. Well, now, what happened next was that in the early 1950s, the percutaneous needle biopsy was developed. We won't go into who developed it. It was brought out as a safe procedure by Iversen and Bruun in Copenhagen. Niels Olwall in Sweden had employed it, but it doesn't matter. It was a very great contribution, and this gradually spread all over the place, came to the United States, where you had such great bioptists, as you like, as Alvin Parrish at the D.C. General, who worked with an old Hopkins man, John Howe. You know John Howe?
Yes.
As a pathologist, Parrish and Howe. And then there was Kark, Murky, Pollock, and Pirani, the pathologist in Chicago, Jennings and Earl in Chicago. Must be something about Chicago. George Schreiner down in D.C. and in Britain, De Wardner and Mike Hutt at St. Thomas's, and Joe Euchers, Ken Porter, and myself at St. Mary's. And we saw large amounts of material, because in those days people would stick a needle in you just as soon as send you a bill, after a cat. So there were a large number of biopsies, but of course in the early days they were all, very few rather, were examined by electron microscopy. This was mainly light microscopy, and of course we developed very good cutting techniques using very thin sections. but very little electron microscopy, and no immunohistology, because, as you pointed out, that came along a little later. So the first few years of the renal biopsy led to the differentiation between various forms of the nephrotic syndrome. This could be dissected out. Lupus, the various different manifestations of lupus came out. Focal glomerulonephritis, we mentioned earlier, was discovered, and conditions such as Schoenlein-Henoch purpura that usually didn't die. We were able to see what the lesion was there, and the lesion in recurrent hematuria. And those were really wonderful days of pathology, of renal medicine, renal pathology in the 1950s. And Mark Euchers was a wonderful stimulus to this at St. Mary's. He did all the biopsies. And London was a great place to be in those days, because there were many medical centres all within an easy bus or a tube ride of one another. And there was a splendid forum for presenting your cases, known as the Renal Association. The Renal Association used to meet once a month, about 7 or 8 times a year at Seba House. And it used to start at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon with tea, and then we'd have the scientific session, and then there would be sherry to wind things up at the end. And all of that for the princely sum of 1 guinea a year. Well, anyhow, it was a great place to present your work, and that was where Joe and I first presented the focal glomerulonephritis. And it was received by Clifford Wilson, who was professor of medicine at the London Hospital, in a most malignant way. He attacked us savagely, and it was all very unpleasant. I don't know precisely why. I think perhaps he felt that it cut across the LS classification, that he'd had something to do with developing. But we got over that, and there's a very interesting sequel to it, that when we had a SEBA symposium in 1961, I think it was, at which the results of about 5,000 renal biopsies worldwide were presented. It was a very good gathering. Arnold Rich was a wonderful chairman of that, and it achieved a great deal by, I think, giving the renal biopsy respectability. So anyhow, there was this wonderful symposium, and at this symposium, Joe and I presented the focal glomerulonephritis stuff again, but now we had over 30 cases. We were on very much stronger ground. And we gave a dual presentation. Joe gave the clinical side, and I gave the pathology. And when I sat down, we saw to our horror that the first man on his feet was Clifford Wilson. And we thought, oh my God, here we go again. But he didn't. He must have become converted, must have seen the error of his ways in the intervening years. And he was very gracious, and he said that this was probably one of the finest contributions that the renal biopsy had made to date. That was the unfolding of the spectrum of focal glomerulonephritis. So honor was satisfied.
Well, there's no gratification better than gratification delayed.
I agree. And then, of course, I remember another, I think it was a terrible incident at Seba House at one of the Renal Association meetings. The only time in my life I've ever been physically thrown off the podium. And an irascible man called McCants, who was the professor of experimental medicine at Cambridge, was presiding. And McCants warned me twice that my time was up. And then the third time he said, "That's enough." And he came up and he got hold of me physically and threw me off the platform. Very humiliating. But I deserved it. And if you'd known McCants, you would have realized that he wasn't a man to trifle with. Well, anyhow, let's proceed with the story. We've now seen how the renal biopsy made these initial contributions. But then when electron microscopy became more widely used, and when immunofluorescence in particular of the immunohistologic techniques was applied, we really took off. And the electron microscopy contributed to the discovery of the characteristic basket weave lesion in Alport syndrome, to dense deposit disease, and numerous others. And of course, immunofluorescence led to the discovery of IgA disease that we talked about briefly earlier, light chain disease, and various other things. In addition to all those contributions to the renal biopsy, we must not forget what the experimental method has contributed. And if you look back over the years, Arnold Rich, of course, was one of the pioneers in this field, followed by Gamuth, Dixon, McCluskey, numerous other people, really worked out the immunologic aspects of renal disease, so that when these were melded with the biopsy studies, made a great deal of sense and formed a basis for not only our understanding but for a reasonable classification too. So there have been tremendous strides taken over the last, gosh, how long have I been at it? Best part of 50 years. And we know a great deal, but there are still enormous gaps in our knowledge. For example, the emphasis has been on glomerular disease and on tubular interstitial conditions. We're still very, very ignorant. But I've no doubt that in the fullness of time, all these matters will be resolved.
It's our earnest hope, it's our tentative faith that it in fact will be. But you know, it occurs to me that you haven't always been just a renal pathologist. There was a time, in fact a long time, when you were not just my boss, but you were the boss of about 200 other people as department chairman. Could you tell us a little about what it was like to be on the inside as department chairman? Because I always approached you in a very deferential fashion. How did it feel to be the big boss?
Well, how did it feel to be the big boss? First of all, I'd rather be the big boss than work under somebody. But let me put it in this way. When I first did that job, and let me correct you, at Hopkins, heads of department are directors, not chairman. When I first started, life was much simpler. During the summer, committees and things stopped, and you could get into your lab and do something that you really enjoyed doing. But as time went by, it got to be a great drudgery. All these new approaches to delivering medical care, cost containment, NIH grants drying up, people coming and sobbing on your shoulders, was really not very pleasant towards the end of my time, and I was really very pleased to be able to step down. And I should just hate to be a departmental director, chairman, whatever you like, in 1995. I don't think people enjoy it anymore. And I think it was very interesting when they were looking for my replacement. They offered the post to several people, mostly research workers, who turned it down. And good luck to them. They felt that in taking on a job like that, it would take them out of their labs, and that was why they went into medicine. And it's a thing that I think is happening with greater frequency. Now, it's very sad because somebody has got to be running the department. But I think what you have got to do is to appreciate, as you know, running the show at Francis Scott Key. It does make tremendous inroads into our time and takes you away from the things that you are trained to do, the things that you do best, and the things that you enjoy doing. So looking back, I obviously could have accomplished considerably more in the research line because I was only doing it with one hand, and sometimes that hand was behind my back. But what I always felt was, no, I could not give up prematurely and work in somebody else's department because there are precious few people that I'd like to work under. And that, I think, is the big advantage of being director of the department, that you're master in your own house. And it would be very unpleasant to be a servant in somebody else's. So, does that answer your question satisfactorily?
It seems to me that what you're saying basically is that as opposed to the time when you took the job when it was a great honor, and B, a lot of fun to do, and now you have to wonder about anybody who is willing to take the job. If they're willing, should you let them?
Well, that's right. That's right. I've often wondered how Arnold Rich, for example, would have reacted to the duties of a present-day director.
That's an interesting question, isn't it? I think Arnold Rich would not have been a happy director in 1995. I think he would have been very competent, but not at all happy, because it wasn't a gentlemanly world that we live in anymore.
Well, that's right. That's another facet of it. It's no longer a gentlemanly world that you work in, but just the very nature of the job, the things you'd have to do, that he had to do. No, he would have quit.
Yes, I think you're right. Well, one of the other big boss type things that you did for quite a spell, 6 or 7 years if I remember, was to be the editor of Laboratory Investigation. And that, too, was a major task. And, of course, you brought to it your abilities as a pathologist, but it requires, to me, different skills. It requires somebody who knows not just his field, but who has an appreciation for the basic spectrum of pathology research in order to know what is appropriate, to get the appropriate people to submit, to get the appropriate people to review, etc.
Yes. As you say, I was the editor, John Boitnott, a very able assistant. I couldn't have done without John. We did it for 5 years, and I would not have done it for another 6 months even, because it is a terribly, terribly tiring job. It's rather, I suppose, like being a newspaper editor, that you've got deadlines to meet, you fret as to whether you've got sufficient articles for a given number. But apart from that, it's really mainly, I think, a matter of bookkeeping, because to do the various tasks that you have mentioned, you use your editorial board. And I suppose that is part of the skill in choosing your editorial board, although we didn't really have much choice in that because we inherited an editorial board. We were able to get rid of some of them and to take some new people on. But I think we did a reasonable job on that journal. Nate Kaufman had been the editor beforehand, and Nate had built it up, and I think we continued doing that. I think it perhaps got a little bit too kidney-oriented, which was only to be expected, but not inordinately so. And we then handed over, and really we were very glad to get rid of it. And I think 5 years that we did was about the ideal time. You see certain editors hanging on to journals for far too long, and you can see the quality of the journal decreasing. You've got to have new blood, and I think about 5 years is the ideal time to be an editor.
Okay. I would be curious to know, another facet of your career has been the fact that you have always been very active in a variety of professional associations, and one of them that comes immediately to mind is the American Society of Nephrology. Tell me a little about that, because you must have been practically in your day the token pathologist on many committees in that organization.
Yes, well, as you know, the American Society of Nephrology began, when was it, in the late 1960s,
yes.
And it was predominantly renal physiologists and clinicians, nephrologists, if you like to call them that, many of whom, of course, grew up in renal physiology. And for several years, pathology was very, very poorly represented. I think I was the first pathologist to be on the council. I was the first pathologist to be the president. It's only this year that there's going to be another pathologist, which is a very sad thing. Ramsey Catran, as you know, is going to be the president for the meeting in San Diego. He thoroughly deserves it. He's a first-class fellow. But it is really very sad that we've had to go 23 years before another pathologist took over as president. And I really do think that pathologists have made a very great contribution to the advancement of nephrology, and I think they are really deserving of better representation. But on the whole, the American Society of Nephrology has been a great success, and is, I think, a truly wonderful society. Its annual meeting is quite spectacular, and I give it absolutely full marks. Great organization.
Yes. What about the International Society of Nephrology?
Well, I've had much less to do with the International Society. I was vice president of the International Society and had hoped to be the president, but some reason was found why I couldn't be. Just another of those wonderful examples of academic politics being so sordid because the stakes are so low. I have very largely forgotten about it, but in certain moments when I'm perhaps feeling depressed, I do think back that I would have enjoyed being president of that organization, but it was not to be.
Okay. Well, you, president of the ISN, or no, you were president of the ASN, and the ASN and the NKF have both made major awards to you. Can you elucidate on that?
Yes, I was very fortunate that sometime back in the 1980s, I was given the David Hume Award of the National Kidney Foundation, and I was deeply flattered to receive that. And then only 2 years ago, so the Boston meeting, I was given the John Peters Award, which I shared with Priscilla Kincaid-Smith, which again gave me great satisfaction, not just getting the award, but sharing it with Priscilla, who is a long-time friend of mine, and it was a wonderful event. Al Michaels was the president that year, and various people, Mel Schwartz, Ed Lewis. They gave me a very nice dinner. You were present, and it was altogether a very happy occasion. And I'm very honored to have received those two awards from National Kidney Foundation on the one hand, American Society of Nephrology on the other.
Well, first of all, the American Society of Nephrology presentation came equipped with a slideshow. And I saw you for the first time in your mid to late 20s and realized that you were not a person who had lost his hair late in life.
No. I lost my very early. I didn't lose it in the modern vogue of having my head shaved like these basketball players and things. No, I started receding when I was a schoolboy, in fact. And I suppose if you look at it, I really haven't lost very much more over the last 20 years. But you're quite right, I've always been a balding person.
Well, let me just say while we're on that subject that for me, you do not look appreciably different than you did the first day I met you in 1961.
Gosh, I must be prematurely old.
No, you didn't have sideburns, and no, I would say on the converse that you haven't aged a great deal. But the sideburns were a later addition.
The sideburns came in, you remember, during the roaring 60s when people were growing their hair long, and I found that they very satisfactorily hid two moles that I've got here, so I kept them.
There's a wonderful picture that you may remember of you at the gross table in the early 1970s, of the year I was chief resident, where you are playing tug of war with Sharon Weiss over a piece of autopsy meat.
That's right. I know that picture.
And you have not really changed a great deal since then.
I know that picture very well. I think Ramsey used it
in that presentation.
When he made the presentation in Boston.
Yes.
And you know, that is very interesting. You were talking of being a departmental director. What is it like? You giving the impression that you were always rather in awe of the head of the department. And of course you're not alone, because this is true, and it's a thing that you don't realize when you are the head of the department. And I remember an incident. It involved you and David Page, the year that you were both the chief residents. And I was talking to you both one day, and I said, what I don't understand is that at the Gross Conference, I ask these intelligent young people who are interns and residents questions, and they cannot give me the answer, or if they do give an answer, they stutter it out as though they can't speak, as though they've never been taught to speak. I said, why is that? What is wrong with them? Are they no good? And you said, look, I forget it was you or David said it, what you've got to realize is that they're all terrified of you. And I just couldn't believe it. But you really, from what you said earlier, you confirm that.
I would not say that I was ever terrified of you, but let's say that I certainly entertained a healthy respect for you.
Yes, well, respect and terror, I think, are rather different. But
yeah.
These people were terrified. I don't know why. You're the kindliest man.
You know, one of the things it's funny, when I ask you about awards and honors, you mentioned the David Hume and the Peters Award, and you did not mention the award that would be the most important for pathologists, and that's the Maud Abbott Lecture, because that is,
in
a sense, the highest honor that we as pathologists can pay to another pathologist.
Oh, really? Oh.
That and the gold-headed cane award.
Yes, I don't know what's happened with the gold-headed cane. I
haven't heard of it in years.
I've never won the gold-headed cane. I'd be rather embarrassed to use it, and I wouldn't see any point in having a cane unless you did. The Maud Abbott Lecture, yes, I gave the Maud Abbott Lecture.
Yes,
You're quite right. I talked on, we had some fancy title for it that Gary Hoffman, who was very quick at these things, drew up. He took quotations from Shakespeare. There is a tide in the lives of all men, and that was the title of the lecture. And then I think there was something added on, reflux of the kidney or something like that.
Those are tides that go strictly up the ureters.
Yes. And of course, they're tides more often in women than men, so it really wasn't all that appropriate.
Exactly. Well, one of the questions that I think is appropriate to ask in this kind of interview is to tell a little about the people who influenced you, because they are, in a very real way, the people who helped to mold you into the person that you are today. Who would you include?
Who would I include? Well, the first person I would include my wife, who's had a very considerable influence on me.
Mostly restraining.
Yes, restraining, and what is good in me comes from her. She has been absolutely wonderful, absolutely selfless, allowed me to go off to meetings, allowed me to spend every evening, every weekend writing this book, doing other things, where she had the job of bringing up the children, and there were 6 of them, and this was no mean task. And I really, looking back, I treated her very, very badly, and I very much regret it. So if I have got to say who has influenced me, I've got to include in that how was I able to do these things. I have got to put her very much and way ahead at the top of the list.
Yes, I would say that she has, in a very real way, made it possible for these accomplishments to occur, and I feel the same debt of gratitude to my wife. But the influences in terms of scientific interest and the thrust of your life are the area in which I was directing my question.
All right. First job I had when I came back from the army was with Alexander Fleming. Fleming was very seldom there. He had just won the Nobel Prize. I think he'd won it in '46. And I went to work with him in the spring of '87, '47. What are we talking about? Back. He won the Nobel Prize '46, and I went to work with him in '47. And he was still doing a great deal of traveling. He was very seldom there. But the thing that I do remember about him was I went to him once. I wanted to do an experiment, and I wanted a small amount of equipment. Rather, I wanted some money to buy some equipment. And it was a trivial amount, about £50 or something like that. And he shook his head and said in his Scottish voice, he said, "Heptinstall," he said, "I can't let you have it." He said, "We have an equation in this department that brains times equipment is a constant." So that is the thing that I remember mainly from Fleming. He taught me frugality.
Well, on the other hand, that's very flattering.
Yes.
Because it's obvious
Yes.
that the equipment was zero.
Yes.
Other people.
Well, I learned pathology under a charming old man. I called him an old man because he always seemed old, although I suppose when I first met him he was just in his 50s, a man called Wilfred Newcomb. And he was an absolutely superb, what in Britain used to be called morbid anatomist. Nowadays, I suppose he'd be a tissue pathologist, a histopathologist. He trained us by throwing us straight in. We were reporting on the surgical specimens the first day we were in the department. Somebody looking over your shoulder, but he expected you, any sensible person, to know that an appendix had got acute inflammation. And he taught us pathology absolutely wonderfully. He was very demanding in accuracy. He was a source of tremendous information, very experienced pathologist, one of these people who never forgets any slide that he's ever seen, and if you took him up a tumor that was rather exceptional, he would say, "Oh, I remember seeing one of those back in 25 or something." And he wasn't kidding you. He'd go into his file and he'd bring it out because he collected everything. And I learned an awful lot from the Nukes, as he was known. I became a reasonably skilled pathologist, but the Nukes was not at all experimentally inclined, and that was the big drawback of that department, and that was why I was so lucky in getting hold of Pickering having picked me up at that very early stage.
And of course, Pickering would have to be, in a sense, the next logical person.
Yes, yes, although I wasn't in the same department, he was in the Department of Medicine. I saw a great deal of him, and he obviously had a tremendous effect on me. He was the man who introduced me to experimental methods. Whenever we wrote papers, it was very apparent that he wrote the most beautiful English, and he continually stressed the fact that you should express yourself in plain, simple Anglo-Saxon words, which of course I knew beforehand, but it did reinforce me. And I have very happy recollections of George Pickering. He left St. Mary's before I did. I think he left I left in 1960. He left in about 1956, I think it was, to go as Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford. And I continued working with him until the time I left to come over here permanently. There is one incident I do remember with Pickering that is rather like the Fleming business, something that he says, in this case he wrote, that you never forget. It was after we had written that paper on the reversibility of malignant hypertension. It was in the Lancet towards the end of 1952, I think, that the editor of the Lancet, Fox, he ran an editorial in the same issue. In England, they call it a leading article. So we'll stick to the term editorial. They had this editorial, and the writer of the editorial, of course they're nameless, never knew who they are, had been given a copy of the paper beforehand so that he could comment on it. And it was a most scurrilous condemnation of what we had written. And the Lancet, of course, came out on a Friday. I had read this going home in the train in the evening, because I lived out in the country in Beaconsfield. And I was working in my garden. I don't know what I was doing in November, probably tidying things up for the winter, when Anne called out through the French windows that led out into the garden. She said, "Pickering's on the phone and he doesn't seem best pleased." So I went over to the phone, and it was crackling. You could feel it. It was trembling. And he informed me that some mischief-making bee had written this terrible editorial leading article, and that it demanded an immediate reply, and could I please get my carcass over to his house as soon as possible. Well, fortunately, he only lived about 5 or 6 miles away. We used to travel up on the same line every day. So I drove over there, and there he was, sitting in his kitchen. He was writing, and he wrote very fluently. And he had got the reply all written. And he just wanted me to fill in 1 or 2 technical details that he wasn't very sure of, which I did. And he said, "All right, you approve, we'll send it off." And it ended up with a most wonderful sentence. I probably can't quote it exactly, because we had been taken to task in this editorial because some of our findings didn't fit exactly with what had been found in the rat. And we were both well aware that it was Clifford Wilson, you see, from the rival school of hypertension, who had written this editorial. And it ended up with a sentence. Now, how did it go? He said, "After all, when human problems are being considered, the evidence from man is entitled to at least a little consideration. And I thought that was absolutely wonderful, and used that many times when I was reviewing grants down at the NIH, because you imagine grants dealing with human things, they were beyond the pale. And if you were going to put anthracene up a rat's rectum, that was wonderful, but the mere mention of doing anything to do with human material not received terribly well. And I think that summed it up absolutely beautifully.
Well, you mentioned earlier, Dr. Euchers, the two of you really sort of put renal biopsy on the map in England.
Well, we did a lot of them. I don't know when we put it on the map. Joe was an absolutely wonderful person. He was a great character. His hair used to fly all over the place. He was always rushing around. And he had made a very great reputation for himself at Hammersmith for his work on the conservative treatment of acute renal failure. Well, he left Hammersmith and he came to St. Mary's, must have been about 1953. So I came in touch with Joe straight away because he was such an attractive personality. And when Bob Murky came over to England, Murky was the man who used to stick the needles in for Bob Koch in Chicago. Murky came over to England, it must have been about 53, 54, and to demonstrate this technique, Joe went along and learnt the technique and did them thereafter. So Ken Porter and I used to interpret the biopsies, and Joe did very, very large numbers of them. And he taught me a great deal about clinical medicine because we used to have frequent meetings. He was also a very astute pathologist. I was telling you, he really got hold of this concept of a focal lesion very, very early on. And Joe and I had some absolutely wonderful times together. He, to me, was one of the best British nephrologists of that period, and there were several very good ones. He was also actually one of the founding fathers of the International Society of Nephrology. He was involved in setting up the first meeting in Avian. And he was also the man who needled Gordon Wolstenholme, who was head of the SIBA Foundation, into putting on a symposium on the renal biopsy, and he played a very big part in that. And Joe was a tremendous nephrologist. I can't speak too highly of him or speak too kindly of the relations we had. In fact, I received a nice little note from him only a few months ago on my 75th birthday of Joe walking. He sent a photograph too, walking along with his dog underneath Euchers and Associate.
Well, the next person that I'm going to ask about, I think, would not have sent such a photograph, and that, of course, is Dr. Rich.
Yes, well, Dr. Rich, you know, had a wonderful sense of humor, but I doubt whether he had much affinity for dogs. Rich, I first met Rich when I came over to do a fellowship with him in 1954. He, unfortunately, was out of town when I got here. He was in Europe, and I met Fred Gamuth. And it struck me that probably I would be well advised to do some work with Gamuth as well as Rich. Well, in the event, it turned out I did most of it with Gamuth, but I did a certain amount with Rich, and saw enough of Rich to realize what a remarkable person he was. He was not only a first-class diagnostic pathologist, which of course you know he was. And only a man with his remarkable powers of observation would have noticed in doing routine autopsies that in what he considered children with lipoid nephrosis, that those who were going on into renal failure would have a selective sclerosis for the glomeruli in the juxtamedullary region. That's just one of the examples of his great powers of observation. He was also a first-class experimentalist, did a great deal of work, as you know, on what we can call delayed hypersensitivity in tuberculosis, did a lot of the early work on hypersensitivity lesions in arterial, glomerular disease. And thirdly, he was just a most inspiring teacher who had a tremendous effect on generations of Johns Hopkins medical students, and well, even the staff too. Oh no, you've got to put Rich right up. He was easily the outstanding pathologist of his day, and probably one of the best of all times. But I think you're right, he wouldn't have, I don't think he liked animals, didn't like exercise, which always struck me as being rather paradoxical when you consider you had to climb about 100 steps, if you remember.
To his house on Club Road?
To his house.
Well, you know, it's interesting. The one reason I only knew him in his older years, when he was partially and then ultimately completely retired. But you have only to look at the pictures of Dr. Rich in our department. In his first picture in 1919,
yes, same suit.
He's wearing a three-piece suit, yes. And when he retires in 1959, he has what could be the same three-piece suit on.
It was a sort of a light brown herringbone suit. I remember it very, very clearly.
And the other thing about Rich that always impressed me as a student was that we nowadays think of Rich primarily in connection with his work on tuberculosis and hypersensitivity. But Rich, at the time I came, in every chapter in Boyd's Textbook of Pathology, there would be a reference of some sort, be it the spleen, the adrenal, the kidney, the lungs, etc. So he was a remarkable man.
Remarkable. Yeah. Because he believed in autopsies, you see.
I believe I still entertain,
And they got lots in those days. Used to about 850 a year, I think. Oh, too many.
You can't have too many autopsies.
But anyhow, remarkable person.
Well, what about Germuth?
Germuth was, again, one of the brightest men I ever met. Germuth, of course, a different generation. Germuth was the same age as I was. And we were both considerably younger than Rich. Germuth had been Rich's chief resident when he was in his training, and then he went off to Washington University, where he did most of his best experimental work. Then he went up to the Brigham for about a year, and then came back to Hopkins, and he just got back to Hopkins when I went for my fellowship. And we got on absolutely swimmingly. So I spent probably 80–90% of my time working with Fred on various aspects of arterial glomerular disease. We demonstrated, I think it was back to the first demonstration of circulating complexes by immunofluorescent methods, and we just had a great time. And it was one of the greatest tragedies that Fred was not appointed to succeed Rich when Rich retired in 1958. And he reacted very violently to that. He quit academic pathology, you remember.
I do.
And went down to Charlotte, North Carolina, to be head of pathology at Charlotte Memorial Hospital, where incidentally another great kidney pathologist had also been head of pathology. That was Paul Kimmelstein.
Oh, yes.
And Fred said he'd never seen such wonderfully trained technicians in his life. They'd been trained by Kimmelstein in a true Germanic way. Well, anyhow, to Fred's everlasting credit, he continued doing research. And then he made a somewhat comeback to academics. He got the chair at St. Louis University. But it didn't last very long, and then he went to a private hospital in St. Louis, where the Holy Sisters who ran the hospital were terribly good to him, gave him research space and funds, and to his dying day, because you know he died young, he was still doing absolutely splendid work. The work we did could have been very good, but we were working in the wrong dose range. We were trying to produce a form of chronic glomerulonephritis by repeated challenge with both bovine serum albumin, bovine gamma globulin, but the animals were producing so much antibody that they weren't going to develop any lesions. But we were just unlucky on that. I cursed Fred later. I said, look, you were the immunologist here. You should have spotted that we were in the wrong dose range. But it didn't matter. We produced a very interesting granulomatous arteritis with this regimen. Yes.
And of course, in the early 70s, Gramuth had his own little brown book, which was the first real synthesis of immunopathology.
Ooh, I should have mentioned that. So good. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Very, very good indeed.
Yeah. It was great. Other people that you worked with, of course, include the famous Hadi. Dr. Hudson was a very striking figure for me, and he must have been for you, since he chopped all your firewood every year.
No, he didn't do that. He chopped it one year. I knew Hadi, of course, in London. Hadi had been at St. Mary's, but when he came back from the army, like me, he changed hospitals, and he went to University College Hospital, where eventually he became the head of radiology. Hadi was a very good example of a person who could do research without having research funding. And there are very few people who do that. They say, oh, I can't possibly do research. I haven't got a grant of $100,000 a year. Hadi did all that original work on tracing out the calyceal outlines of children with chronic infections, did all that on routine material, going through the radiology department, did it all in the evening, an absolutely stupendous task, and so much came of it because Hadi quite literally revolutionized people's concepts of chronic pyelonephritis.
He certainly did.
He and David Edwards, of course, were the first to suggest that reflux was going to play a significant role in this, and unfortunately, we said before, reflux nephropathy has rather supplanted chronic pyelonephritis. But Hadi, more than any single person, laid the foundations and built on them for our understanding of renal infections. And it was a great privilege for me to be able to give a sort of not a funeral oration, but a tribute to him at a symposium on urinary tract infections in Gothenburg in Sweden shortly after he died. Great man.
I still use one of his illustrations of the different arrangements of calyces that he drew from both from his radiologic and from his dissection work. There are various kinds of flowers. You have small flowers and then large flowers.
He was quite a good artist, you know.
Yes, he drew the picture.
Yes. And he was a most wonderful raconteur, wonderful storyteller. In fact, Hadi could do almost anything he set his mind to.
One of the other greats that it seems to me that we should comment on is Dr. Goldblatt.
Well, Harry Goldblatt, I met Goldblatt first when I was a fellow. I had a letter of introduction to him from George Pickering, and I went over to Cleveland, where he had just returned. Goldblatt, you see, was originally at Western Reserve in Cleveland. Then he went out to the Cedars of Lebanon in Los Angeles. He didn't like that very much, and he came back to Cleveland, but instead of coming back to Western Reserve, he went to the Sinai Hospital, where he was head of pathology. So I went over and I met him there, and it was a very interesting meeting, because during our conversation, suddenly his telephone would ring and he'd get up. He said, oh, you can come down with me. I've got a frozen section to read. And here was this distinguished investigator reading frozen sections, because he was like Rich, you see. He was a well-trained human pathologist. He knew his pathology. So I spent a day with him, and it was such a fascinating day. And he said, look, you must come back. He said, I'd like to do for you what Bayliss did for me. And I said, oh, what was that? Bayliss was a very famous English physiologist, as you know. It was Bayliss who showed that the blood vessel responds to increased pressure by contracting down. I suppose they give it some name now.
No, I'm happy to say it's still known as the Bayliss reflex.
Oh, is it really? Yes. Well, anyhow, Harry Goldblatt, as a young man, had gone over to London on a fellowship, and he spent part of his time with Bayliss. As he said, Bayliss taught him tricks with animals, how to deal with animals, how to do things with them. He said, and I'll do the same for you. He said, you come back one day and we'll have a good time together. Well, this didn't happen until I was over to Henry Ford's symposiums when I was still in England in 1959, and I arranged to spend a few weeks in Cleveland again. Anne was terribly forbearing about that. She gave me permission to do that. So I spent a few weeks with Harry, where he taught me tricks. We did all sorts of things. He showed me how to put these clamps on, how to debark dogs, which really didn't appeal to me a great deal, and numerous other experimental procedures. And I had a great time with him, and have a tremendous admiration for Harry Goldblatt, because he must just have missed getting a Nobel Prize for two completely unrelated topics. Goldblatt always claimed that the best work he did was not the hypertension work, or put it more simply, he said the problem he saw most clearly was his work on the anti-rachitic factor, because that was what he was doing at the Lister Institute in London on his Beit Fellowship. He got a Beit Fellowship, B-E-I-T. I think Beit was one of these people like Rhodes who made a lot of money in South Africa. I may be wrong on that. And he endowed fellowships for people in the British Commonwealth. And Harry Goldblatt, although he was American, had been to McGill as a medical student. So he qualified for Beit Fellowship, and he took his at the Lister in London, where he worked on the anti-rachitic factor. And then he went to work with Bayliss for 6 months. That was where he learned his tricks. And then he went over to work with Erdheim for a year. So Harry was a much-traveled man. Then he came back and did all his wonderful work on hypertension again, for which he could quite easily have got a Nobel Prize. But he was a man, he was rather like Hoddy, a man of very fixed opinions, and I suppose that's true of all of us who've thought about a matter. They think they're right. And Harry could not accept that essential hypertension, the vascular changes were the consequence of blood pressure. He thought it was some naturally occurring disease that was producing the hypertension. Yes. But another great man, and such a humble, such a nice man.
There is a wonderful article about him in a recent textbook of hypertension, whose authors I'm blocking on. It's called Goldblatt Revisited, and not only does it discuss his very seminal work, but it shows Goldblatt himself and also his dogs. There's a picture of Flossie. Yes. Flossie apparently was one of his stars.
Yes, I think I know the book you mean. Isn't it Lara and Brenner? Isn't it in that
Something
one?
Like that, yes.
Let me just say something about his dogs. There is so little pathology in Goldblatt's work, and the reason is that he was so fond of his dogs he could never kill them. There's one good reason why we perhaps worked with rats, rabbits, that you couldn't grow terribly fond of them.
Yes, and of course you've heard the joke recently that it's been suggested that rather than rats and rabbits we should use lawyers because you're even less fond of them.
Oh, yes, yes. Shakespeare knew all about that, you know. There's a line, I forget what it comes in, kill all the lawyers.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Another name that I associate with you, because I used to go down on occasion with you to Georgetown for renal biopsy conferences is Dr. Schreiner.
Oh, yes, yes. George, I've no doubt George will be in the series, and George will be able to speak for himself. But I should just like to say that I owe a lot to George, because he had this wonderful renal biopsy service that I used to take advantage of. I used to go down there about twice a month, saw the most wonderful material, had great conferences, great discussions with George and Jack Ma, who unhappily, as you know, died a few years ago. They used to do the clinical side, and they were absolutely great. And the other thing that I owe to George is that he was the person who gave me the entree to American nephrology. If I hadn't had him, I would probably just have remained a sort of an unknown name in Baltimore. But he introduced me to all these people. He was the person who got me interested in the American Society of Nephrology, and I have a great affection for George, and very fond of him. Wonderful man. Very similar to Hardy. Wonderful storyteller. Great sense of humor.
Yes, so as a matter of fact, of course, for a number of years when it first started, the American Society of Nephrology basically worked out of his office.
It did, entirely, on a shoestring.
On a very small shoestring, a very short one, as the metaphor goes.
Great.
What about speaking? We've talked about all of these people, but many of the people that we've discussed, for example, Goldblatt and Hadi and George Schreiner, were not pathologists. Since you've lived through, as it were, the history of nephrology in the U.S., tell us about some of the people who have been actual nephropathologists that you've known. One name that comes immediately to mind, because he once came to your lab when I was a student, is Paul Kimmelstein.
Yes. You have a very, very good memory.
I certainly do.
Yeah. Because you're younger than I should have. Kimmelstein, yes. Kimmelstein was rather like Newcomb, a pathologist of the old school, well-versed in human pathology. He, I don't think, did any experimental work, but on the other hand, he made the most tremendous contributions by observing problems in man. And Kimmelstein came over from Europe in Hitler's time. He went to Boston, and he did work in Boston on diabetes, the so-called Kimmelstein-Wilson lesion, the same Wilson, incidentally, as the Wilson who berated us at the meeting. Clifford Wilson. Clifford Wilson was a young fellow over here working with Kimmelstein. He also worked on infections of the kidney, and I differed with him in his interpretation of chronic pyelonephritis. He was much more lenient in its diagnosis than I was. And Kimmelstein had a very, very great influence on American nephrology. I always got on with him very well. Yes, Kimmelstein will give him full marks because of his using human material.
Yes, which he obviously knew a great deal about. Two of the standards in the field when I was growing up, in addition to yourself, were Drs. Churg and Pirani.
Yes.
They were sort of standards, as it were.
Oh, no. I knew, still know, both of them very well. They're both alive. Jack Churg is now in his 80s and is just as spry as ever he's been. Again, Jack was no great experimentalist, but made some wonderful studies in human material. And as you were saying of Rich, that Jack was just not confined to the kidney. I mean, Jack worked on the lung, he worked on blood vessels, absolutely top-class electron microscopist, and I'd say the chief thing that I like about Jack Churg is that he is just probably the kindest man I've ever met. He is the kindest and the gentlest man. He will do anything for you. If you want a slide of a rare condition to show at a meeting or something, he will be sure to have it. And Jack, God bless him, is an absolutely first-class fellow and doing very well. At least he was the last time I spoke to him.
I saw him just a few weeks ago,
You did?
and he was lecturing, as
Yes.
usual. He gave a super lecture.
Yes.
And you're exactly right. He is one of the people of whom it can truly be said that he never stepped on a single back
No.
on his way up.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Now, you asked about Pirani. Conrad Pirani, again, I have known for years and years. I first met Conrad when I was over on my fellowship, because I visited Krakow in Chicago, and that was where Conrad came from. But he made his great reputation as the pathologist to the renal biopsy group, headed by Koch, and there was Koch, we mentioned this before, Koch, Murky, Pollock, and Pirani. Conrad was the man who kept them honest and did all the pathology. And he made great contributions. And another thing that Conrad did that is in very widespread use now is he was, I can't say with certainty the first, but I'm sure one of the first, to exploit the semi-quantitation of tissue sections, and that has been of tremendous help to us. No, great man.
Yes, I remember when I was young, you waited every year, because every year there would be a classic article in medicine from the Chicago group.
Yes.
This year on diabetes,
Yes.
next year on lupus,
They
next
contributed
year
so much.
on
Yes.
subacute bacterial
Yes.
endocarditis.
Yes.
It was always a superb
Yes.
article. I can't close, though, without asking you about one of my all-time favorites, and that's Madame Habib, who is almost single-handedly for France what all of you were for the U.S. and the United
Yes.
Kingdom.
La femme formidable.
Absolutely.
Like you, I've known Renee for many, many years, and she was French renal pathology.
Yes.
In fact, you could probably put her as Europe's chief renal pathologist. Renee, an incredible woman, is the only word I can use to describe her. Tremendous energies, tremendous powers of observation, being able to put things together. Great trainer of people. Just look at the flock of young people who came out of her department.
Yes.
Renee has made a lot of contributions. I first knew her years and years and years ago when she came over to spend a year with Martin Bodian at Great Ormond Street, children's pathologist. And that was really before she got into the kidney. But my word, she did so well.
Yes, and has made the definitive contribution in so many areas.
Exactly.
For example, many things she wrote about first. She really was the person who first analyzed large numbers of focal sclerosis. But she turns out to be the only person really to have ever written about oligomeganephronia. It should be called Habib's disease.
Yes, yes, yes.
She's fantastic. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. I had anticipated that we would sit here in some sort of wooden fashion and talk about old times.
You should have known it better
haltingly.
than that.
But in fact, it's been sensational. I very much enjoyed it, and I hope the audience does too.
Okay, and thank you very much, Gary, for treating me so kindly. Thank you.
Pleasure was mine.